Hello, good evening, everybody, or wherever you are in the world. And I'm delighted to have Kevin back. I've been on the road for a bit, and we are resuming our Saturday night series, which everyone that's tuning in, we really appreciate the community we've built here with you guys and Kevin. And Kevin really appreciates you supporting his work, clicking on his links, and reading his books, in which there are way more details than you're hearing on these streams. And I also want to give a shout out to Emma on the Imagination podcast. She's just done a 2-hour one with Kevin, Mind Controlled Culture, Why and How It Was Created. So I would urge people to check that one out as well. Now, many of you are fascinated by MKUltra. We had O'Neill on years ago who wrote the book about MKUltra and the Manson family chaos. And, it's just to think that our own governments and hierarchies, and in this case, we're focusing on royal, Vatican, and military mind control, that they continue these experiments to this day, and they can do the most horrific things to people in the name of national security, because if they don't have the edge on the other countries of the world, then the other countries of the world are going to conquer us, or whatever justification they've got. The communists are coming, the domino effect that authorizes us to find vulnerable people, push them to the brink of insanity by hugely torturous experiments. Kevin was on the podcast. Kevin was talking about kids getting thrown in the snow and people getting things stuck up their noses and things put in their brains, and it's absolutely diabolical that our governments can get up to this. But anyway, Kevin is going to expand on this for us. And Kevin, thank you for coming on. Should we just go over some of the basics? Because I imagine some of the viewers are not familiar with MKUltra, and you're steeped in the history of it, the Nazis, etc.
Yeah, well, I mean, the term was kind of popularized, like many things, like Fort Detrick, Maryland, named after a Nazi scientist, brought over under Project Paperclip after the war. And MKUltra was supposed to refer to mind control in German, MK, German, ultra. And that's because the early experiments were pioneered by not only the Nazis, but just like with the sterilization and the eugenics movement to create a so-called master race, it actually originated among American psychiatrists in the late 19th century. And the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute in Berlin picked it up, and the Nazis popularized it in that. So there was this kind of like transatlantic community of mind controllers and eugenicists working, on this whole thing. But it became huge and went into overdrive right after World War II. As part of the Cold War environment created the perfect cover and camouflage, in the same way churches provide camouflage for a lot of these crimes. And under the guise of that, it became a major industry, and it's still thriving because it's tied into human trafficking, the whole culture of silence and that around all these heinous crimes that we've been documenting. So yeah, it's definitely kind of, that's the general context for all of it we're going to talk about.
And years ago, when I read about it in a David Icke book, I thought this was preposterous. But in this day and age, MKUltra now has its own wiki page, and it confirms, it starts out saying MKUltra was an illegal human experimentation program designed and undertaken by the U.S. Central Intelligence Agency to develop procedures and identify drugs that could be used during interrogations to weaken individuals and force confessions through brainwashing and psychological torture. The term MKUltra is a CIA cryptonym. MK is an arbitrary prefix standing for the Office of Technical Service, and ultra is an arbitrary word out of a dictionary used to name this project. The program has been widely condemned as a violation of individual rights and an example of the CIA's abuse of power, with critics highlighting its disregard for consent and its corrosive impact on democratic principles. There's pages and pages and pages of it on Wiki now. And what first brought it to your attention, Kevin, in your own field?
Well, I'll tell about that momentarily, but what I wanted to comment on that was that that's a classic government spin description. It makes it seem like it's a very narrow thing that happened in the past, and now we've acknowledged it and we're moving on, right? it was much broader than that, and it wasn't about simple interrogation. It was basically the military and government agenda was, how did you create the perfect robot, the unthinking soldier who is devoid of emotion and critical thinking and will obey orders that have application for government, any ruler anywhere, but also the military, especially them. So it is a much broader thing than it's described there. The way I found out about it first, not only, like a lot of us, we have contact with this in everyday life, and even meeting people who've been through these things where they often don't have a lot of memory of it. But I had the fortunate background of being, well, before I went into the ministry back in the 1980s, I paid my way through university by working in the University Psychiatric Hospital, University of British Columbia, as a psych assistant, and also in the community mental health field. So I worked in halfway houses. And from people on the ground, I began to learn, this is like 40 years ago, people who had been through these programs, not only electric shock, sensory deprivation, and all this stuff, but hearing a lot of other strange things. I remember back in the 80s, I helped form a coalition to stop the formation of the Canadian Security Intelligence Service, which is like Canada's so-called version of the CIA, because they were operating under completely illegal secret legislation that nobody could know about. They weren't accountable in that. And in one of our rallies in Vancouver to oppose CSIS, a woman came in, she had this metal foil around her head. And she said, well, it's to stop the directed energy weapons. And everyone was kind of laughing because at that point we thought, okay, here's a crazy thinking she's being beamed. But as it turns out, she had been a survivor of one of these things. And she's the first person I ever heard that term from, directed energy weapons. So here's a kind of that's almost a metaphor for the situation we're in. Survivors are everywhere around us. And the evidence is all out there. It's just the believability and where do you take it, when you have this knowledge. So that was a great springboard into when I got to Port Alberni and began to work with Native people. Then the comments people were making to me when they were describing having gone through these death camps they call residential schools, almost every one of them would describe cultic aspects to what had happened to them. Children disappearing, being kept off in isolated rooms, ceremonies outside, Indian hospitals attached to the residential schools where children who spoke their own language would go in and be sterilized or be used in medical experiments. All of those stories were coming out along with everything I began to document as far back as 1992 when I began ministry there in Port Alberni. So it was a kind of plunge in the deep end on this stuff. If you work in a community like with Native people or any disenfranchised group, the evidence is everywhere in people's lives. We even began to get documentation of this from people, maverick investigators and that, who when they heard about me in the press would come to me with reams of evidence, stuff that had been, like with the residential school crimes, buried and just resurfaced by individuals, So that's kind of initially how I began to get into this latest aspect of it.
Right? People are asking about survivors. I did interview Anna Lee, who was an MKUltra tunnel survivor. The link for that podcast is in the description box, and I'll put it in the live chat. And someone just asked about Manson and that. In O'Neill's book, he's showing how Manson, who'd done horrific crimes, anal, R-word of a teenage girl, for example, and a plethora of other stuff, and just repeatedly they just released him and the Manson family because his handlers had him in this MKUltra experiment whereby they wanted to destroy the view of the positive, peaceful hippie, the war protesting hippie. They wanted to spoil that, and they knew if they put rats and mice on not just LSD but meth combined, they would form marauding troops of assaulters, sexual assaulting rodents and cannibal rodents, and they would, all this mayhem would result. And basically that's what they did with the Manson family, folks. They put them on the amphetamines and the LSD and just unleashed them on society. So it was an MKUltra experiment that worked out perfectly for the government. People think it was out of control, but it wasn't. They were allowed over and over again to get out of all of the charges. until it got to the point where they just went absolutely on a murderous rampage.
Right.
And Kevin, you were giving some frightening examples in your interview with Emma. Do you want to expand on some of those, like the kids getting thrown in the snow, etc.?
Yeah, well, just before that, I wanted to comment on the whole Manson thing, because I was actually approached not too long ago by a former CSIS agent called Grant Wakefield, who had been investigating the connection between serial killing and these experiments. He got tossed out of CSIS for doing that. They tried to put him in a psych ward himself, the usual thing they do. But he said he found that there was a definite connection. And in fact, there was a notorious serial killer of children called Clifford Olson in Canada. And they finally put him away. But he had been captured numerous times and then let go. And in fact, one of the things he was doing, literally driving bolts through the heads of children while they were still alive, pain threshold experiments. Pain threshold experiments were at the cutting edge of all the Nazi and MKULTRA research in Canada, especially, because Canada was a big testing ground for a lot of this stuff. And as part of that, I'll show you. In fact, and I've got this all in murderbydecree.com. You can view this in chapter 1 of my book. The guy who investigated with the Dr. Pitts, Charles Pitts, and his parents had run residential schools. And Charles Pitts wrote, January 4th, 1937, these children were found naked in their underwear in the snow. And I cannot support a claim that they were trying to get home to their parents. It doesn't fit with the evidence. 2 days later, after the official inquiry happens, he says, no, they were fully clothed. They were trying to get home to their parents. So whether somebody put a gun in his mouth or whatever, he switches his story in 48 hours. In fact, what happened with these children was that they were part of pain threshold experiments in these hospitals. Like the Nazis did. You read about this at Auschwitz and other places. They take Russian prisoners of war, strip them naked, throw them out in the snow, and see how long they last. In order to see the limits of human endurance to cold for military application, for their soldiers when they're in winter and that kind of thing. So it came out of that. But it's the only picture that's ever been basically an early, pain threshold experiments that MKULTRA was really all about. They were experimental. They weren't just creating sleeper assassins and spies and that. They were probing the limits of the human brain. And that's another part of this that I wanted to show you. At a place called the Nanaimo Indian Hospital, this is on military land, set up in conjunction with the churches that ran these residential schools. We went there in 2012 with a survivor. Now, his name is Kenny Quatel. He was one of the first Native people I met in Port Alberni. And Kenny had been, at a young age, he was being worked on in a hospital for spinal bifida. They drug him, take him out of the hospital. They tell his family that he died on the operating table. Then they take him off to the Nanaimo Indian Hospital, where he was held for 9 years in this one hospital. And under hypnosis and with a psychic investigator present, who was police accredited, she had been used in finding children in that. He helped draw this. And these are our notes. And he said he viewed, that's a probe going up the nostril into the midbrain area of the brain. It's like the early lobotomies where they would go in under the eyeball here and stick a probe in, destroy all the ganglia, separate all the nerves here in the midbrain area to see. Well, in the words of the psychic investigator, this is what she says: the aim was to destroy critical thinking and emotional responses. They're frozen and incapacitated, numbing and immobilizing people into a detached yet functional state. So in other words, they're like machines. They don't have, you can't think critically, you can't have your normal emotion. Everything that makes us human, severed right there through these experiments. And that was really getting closer to the purpose of these MKULTRA experiments, how to create a population of robots. And there are 4 stages, and I want to talk about the stages historically of how this developed to the present day. But we can get onto that maybe in a bit. But.
Yeah, let's please do that. But before we do that, as I'm listening to what you were saying, that's kind of thing what these people's sick minds reminded me of Jeffrey Dahmer, because he was trying to drill people's, move things around in people's brains and put things in people's brains and pick up people's brains to control them, wasn't he? To make them kind of, they would still be alive, so they wouldn't leave him. That was their thing. Don't leave me. Stay. Have another beer. And he thought he could just create these zombies that would be with him and not leave him.
Well, you know, the old adage, if you're abused, you abuse others. Okay, so Clifford Olson, Jeffrey Dahmer, all these guys are survivors of these experiments. They saw children getting drilled like that. They saw live experiments, vivisection, all these other things on children. So they began to do it themselves, but they were deliberately released into the population as well. It's part of, as we, you know, a lot of people know now, you got to keep the human brain frequency in a state of panic and fear all the time, more easily conditioned that way. And I mean, just look around us, right?
Yeah. So what are the 4 stages then, please?
Okay. So in the early period, so we're talking like 1930s to the 60s, it's the crudest form of mind control. It's surgical. So things like lobotomies, that's where they began to come into vogue. I don't know if you saw, there was a movie with Jessica Lange called Frances, Frances, about a Hollywood actress in the 30s called Frances Farmer. And she was quite militant in her politics, and she challenged kind of the movie mogul system in Hollywood. She was always outspoken about Nazism and all this stuff. So they targeted her. They arranged a car accident where she was arrested. She had a drinking problem, so they arrested her for being under the influence. They take her to a hospital called Steilacoom. This is a mental asylum in Seattle, near Seattle, in northwest coast of the U.S., right near Vancouver, actually. And did you see One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest? You know, the movie with Jack Nicholson? Okay,
And I've read the book, yes.
Ken Kesey worked at Steilacoom, and it was the place where Jose Delgado developed the first lobotomy experiments. I mean, they'd have people sitting in a circle, drugged, and he'd be going around with a pick going boom, 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 and lobotomizing a dozen people in 5 minutes, right? And Ooh. That's what they did with Frances. They lobotomized her, and she ended up a complete vegetable. And they broadcast that all over as if to say, which they always do, look what, you know, if you guys get out of line, look what we're going to do to you, right? And so that was the early stage of surgical, also through hypnosis, electric shock and stuff like that. Okay, those methods. But after that, by the time of the 60s, and again, don't forget, the CIA introduced LSD into the general population through, they ran houses of prostitution where they would pay prostitutes to lace the drugs of their clients with LSD, and then with a two-way mirror, they'd film it to see the reaction. And LSD was developed by Nazi scientists at Fort Detrick and at Montauk on Long Island as part of a mind control drug, you know, to interrogate people, but also, you know, all these other purposes. And they found, okay, chemical methods work better than surgical. But they only worked in a majority of the population, but it didn't take. Drugs like, there was an early version of the rape drug called Largactil. And in fact, in documents out of the Indian Affairs Archives, I found references to the use of these drugs in the residential schools and hospitals. Largactil would reduce people to a state of semi-zombie-like state. There was a more refined version called chlorpromazine, which they still use in psych hospitals and that, to reduce people to a state of, like we said earlier, disinterest and unconsciousness, even though you're awake. Okay, but those methods don't work on everybody because they're chemically based. And the third method they came up with, which is far more effective and is used now a lot, is the electronic. Because don't forget, our minds, just like our bodies, according to quantum physics, we're all just energy waves. And every memory, every thought, every feeling we have exerts a certain frequency. As a matter of fact, it's called a Schumann resonance. You might have read about this. It's the natural frequency of the Earth. It's 7.83 hertz. That's the frequency of the human brain. We're in tune with Mother Earth, naturally. But you can manipulate that. And for example, 7.83 hertz, the average hertz in the city is 60. So living in a city, you're ramped up to an unnatural state of, and then being on the iPads and that, it's even more unnatural because you're bombarded constantly. So the electronic means you can beam that any motion, any thought, you can beam it at people and affect their thoughts electronically. And in fact, they find that it works in over 98% of people, but With a certain percentage, it doesn't work. And I've got my own theories about what that is. It has to do with kind of more questions of spirituality and soul, in that there's a certain number of us who aren't affected by even that. But the fourth stage, which is more serious, is it's what we're experiencing now, and it's systemic. It's how to incorporate the human psyche and being into a big electronic matrix where we actually don't own our minds anymore, or a component, if you like. And that's what, I think we're dealing with now. But as part of that, could you put on the screen the images of that Dr. Wilder Penfield? Because I want to give you a specific example of who developed this stuff.
Yeah, was that the first image at the top of the email?
Yeah, there are a couple of them of him, actually. That's him. He was a Nobel laureate. He worked out of Canada at this next photo, which is the Montreal Neurological Institute, actually connected to what's called the Allen Memorial Institute. Yeah, that's Penfield. He was a guy who developed through brain surgery. He could stimulate part of the brain, and the person would hear music from their childhood that recover certain memories. So he was probing on how to control those aspects of the brain. He was one of the major recipients of CIA money. And there was an eyewitness who I sent you the picture of as well, Ann Diamond. She was a friend of mine. That's her name was Ann McAllister originally. She was an early victim of MKUltra. That's her. She's written a great book called My Cold War by Ann Diamond. She's a Montreal writer. And she and her twin brother were taken in and used by Ewan Cameron and Wilder Penfield. Now, Ann first connected with me when she heard my work. We've known each other over 20 years. She said when she was a little girl, she was brought in, and there was Dr. Wilder Penfield, this so-called Nobel laureate. And there they had just brought in cages of children, and most of them were Aboriginal. And she learned that they had been brought from the local reservation, where the tribal council chief literally sold their own children to the government for these experiments. And she saw Penfield take these kids out experimental on. She said she even saw him strangle one of the children to death when he was fighting and resisting being used. And they were being created, just had a lot of neural and chemical research done on them to see, as part of the MKUltra experiments, how do you wipe out a personality and recreate it? That was kind of the research aim. And so, like I say, it's funny, when I was talking to Anne the first time, she said, I can ride on a bus and spot survivors. It's a look in their eyes. I can just, we know each other when we see it. And she said, there's a lot of us walking around, but they usually just end up on the street, drink themselves to death or whatever, but they're all the living witnesses to these things, right?
Yeah. Let's just go over this a bit more slowly then.
Yeah.
Because we've got phrenology was kind of the precursor for this. And let me just show some images, some of the phrenology images. So, this is from the 1800s. I think it started in the 1700s, but they've got the brain parts mapped out. And that's a numbered one, but let me show you this one. So they've got all these different parts of the brain. Adhesiveness is one. We've got alimentiveness, amativeness, acquisitiveness, causality, cautiousness, combativeness, concentrativeness, constructiveness, destructiveness, ideality, love of life, philoprogenitiveness, and secretiveness. And they thought that the size of the skull. Can you expand on phrenology, Kevin?
Well, as much as I know about it, it was the belief that the shape of the human skull and that was an indicator of intelligence, predilection to do crimes. It was believed that criminals had a different shaped skull and mind, and you had to work on their mind to make them not criminals anymore. And this led into a lot of eugenics theories, which has said, well, for example, Negroes have a smaller skull on average, therefore they're dumber. And of course, Northern Europeans, so-called Aryans, had the biggest skull and brain of all. It was tied into that eugenics argument that you had to eliminate people from the population the mentally retarded. For example, in America, there's a good book, War Against the Weak by Edwin Black, where he shows that the movement to create a master race began in America, went over to Nazi Germany, went back after the war, kind of back and forth. But Edwin Black in his book describes exactly that, how the early sterilization laws in 38 of the 50 states said if you had a child who was born with a low IQ, automatic sterilization, couldn't allow them to breathe. All the sterilization laws in Canada that were passed right at the same time the Nazis were in power. That's how a lot of Native children got sterilized in the Indian schools and hospitals. Virginia Baptiste, one of the eyewitnesses, said she spoke her language, she got a red tag, had to go lie under the x-ray machine, got sterilized. Her brother, and relatives who wouldn't go to church on Sunday got sterilized. It was a law in Canada, you could do that. So, well, not a law, but an act of the Crown, order in council, passed secretly. So, I mean, it was part of that idea that you could determine everything by the size, the shape of the human skull, right?
Yeah, so they'd allocated parts of the brain that they thought did this and that.
Right.
And then MKUltra came along, and you've got stage 1, where they're targeting parts of the brain. Is that what you said earlier? Yeah,
well, of course, this was kind of what you're looking at was kind of a cruder 19th century thing. They found out a lot more about where, like that Dr. Penfield, who we showed, his whole thing was to find out what areas of the brain are responsible for what. And fairly soon they found out that the midbrain area is the one that was primarily responsible for critical thinking, the ability to have a will, a personality of your own, to be able to question things, question authority, say, okay, they say something, but is it true or not? Instead of just blandly accepting, what's official as the truth. All of that area is in the midbrain part, and that's the area they definitely targeted, right, for all these experiments.
And in this first stage, where did they select the people from that they experimented on?
Prisoners. It wasn't just children, but which they got. The churches had a program all over the world of providing children in return for funding to various drug companies, but also the military, the government, and prisoners, military personnel, like Ann Diamond and her brother were both children of a soldier in the Canadian Army. So military children are pre-adapted, following orders, having a stern domestic environment, more easily used. Native children, of course, were deliberately violated and consistently in these places, sexually and every other way, in order to create multiple personalities. Because if you're traumatized enough, especially at a young age, at a pre-verbal age, you tend to dissociate into multiple personalities. Perfect. That's exactly what they needed for these experiments. So it was all designed deliberately to create this traumatized personality who are then more easily manipulated. Right?
So we've got 1,000 people watching live presently across all platforms. All of Kevin's links are in the description box, his books, his other broadcasts, etc. Please support his important work. We're talking about the different stages of MKUltra. So if you have got any questions pertaining to mind control, whether it's royal, Vatican, military, etc., please put them in the chat. Please stick on the subject. And the first stage, they were going in the brain and poking around and doing stuff to the brain. What was the second stage again, Kevin?
Chemical. So in the drug culture in the 50s and 60s, developing drugs like chlorpromazine, largactil, the things that would suppress consciousness and the capacity to act on conviction. And, it's called the limbic system in the brain. It's one of the unique things that even primates don't have. And in the human evolution, in the brain evolution, us people develop this limbic area, which is empathy. It's compassion. It's like when somebody's down on the ground, you run over and help them. I mean, that area. And it's interesting because in psychopaths and sociopaths, that area of the brain is not really developed at all. It's the thing that keeps us human. Well, that was part of the midbrain area that was targeted, because they can literally get people who love one another to turn on each other and become aggressive. And a lot of the research over the last 50 plus years has been developing those chemical means to separate us from our normal personalities and the things that bond people together. And that's the chemical phase, which was quite huge and had massive funding.
So would you say that, you know, on one coast we had Timothy Leary, on the other coast, you referenced Ken Kesey earlier. Would you say that they were two of the principals, conduits through which the CIA flooded America with LSD?
Well, I don't know about Ken Kesey. I don't know enough of his background. Tim Leary definitely was on the CIA payroll. In fact, he was an early consultant to the CIA about this in the Montauk experiments on Long Island. And like I say, out of Fort Detrick, Maryland, the main chemical warfare plant in America, staffed entirely by Nazi doctors who had pioneered this stuff under Mengele and others. And it's interesting, I should mention, we haven't mentioned the Vatican yet, but they were a major conduit for this. They still are in terms of funding this research and everything. But they had a long agreement with the various drug companies and the military to provide children. So I wrote a play a few years ago that got banned on 3 occasions because it was called The Land of No One. And it was the play looks into the real life story of this Dr. George Darby, who we call Dr. Oliver Pierpoint in the play. And Pierpoint's daughter and wife find out about these experiments he did at the Nanaimo Indian Hospital. And a woman, Sheila Ambrose, a native woman, comes forward and challenges him and tries to sue him. And the play is about that and about how it's being used today on all of us. Well, we first tried to develop this play and produce it on Vancouver Island. It was shut down by these 2 native chiefs who were Catholic native chiefs. And it turned out one of them, their father, had been the chief who brought children in to these experiments in the Nanaimo Indian Hospital. So naturally, you know, I kind of hit a raw nerve in their family to be talking about what dear old dad did. But every time we tried to produce this, one more time in Canada and once in the States, it gets shut down after a few weeks, right into production, just boom. And, you know, it's because we're naming these methods. And, you know, I mean, like it's been well documented about the Vatican role in bringing Nazi doctors into America, South America. Mengele, one of the women who was involved, the sole survivor of these experiments at a place called the Lincoln Park Air Force Base in Calgary, Gail Perkins. She said when she was held down and first experimented on, she saw this tattoo right there on the arm of this doctor who went by the name Heinz Lehman, although his code name was Major Bob Armstrong. They gave them pseudonyms in the Royal Canadian Air Force. But he was an SS doctor brought in, you know, under Project Paperclip. And these were pain threshold experiments. Every child in that group of 21 of them, they all died under his knife, under, you know, literally being ripped apart. And she was kept alive. Gail was kept alive as a control element to see how good the, you know, 30 years down the road, how well does this conditioning take? Gail and her husband, I sat down with them on Salt Spring Island. This is 15 years ago now. They tried to sue the Canadian government for the harm that had happened to her. The Sergeant Dan Gassot from the Canadian Military Intelligence Section flies out to their home and says, he was very sympathetic, and he said, I've been into all the files. This Major Bob Armstrong, the SS doctor, he ran all the programs across Canada. It wasn't just there. Thunder Bay, Lakehead Psychiatric Hospital, the Montreal Neurological Institute, all of these Air Force bases across the country doing these experiments. This SS doctor was running all of them. He goes back, he wants to advocate for it. He goes back to Ottawa. They get a phone call a week later and he says to them, I never spoke to you. We never had this conversation. If you ever try to pursue this, you're going to end up in jail or worse. Goodbye, click. You know, I mean, that's how quickly it shut down, because it's like why we're never sued for this stuff, because they know it's true. They don't want it in a court of record. They just want to silence it all because it's still being applied and used, right?
Of course. And viewers, thanks for all the questions coming in. We will get those to Kevin. We're just going over the stages and the origins of MKUltra. A lot of the Nazis, the Vatican through the rat line, helped them escape to South America, where they implemented these programs. They became torturers and experimenters and death squads for South American governments, all backed by the CIA, who justified it, you know, saying they were fighting the war against communism. And we touched on Ken Kesey. And the thing that brought him to my attention, because one of my favorite authors is Tom Wolfe. I don't know if you've read this book, The Electric Kool-Aid Acid Test. Tom Wolfe's a really brilliant author. And this book presents a first-hand account of the experiences of Ken Kesey and a group of psychedelic enthusiasts known as the Merry Pranksters, who traveled across the US in a colorfully painted school bus. They became famous for their use of psychedelic drugs such as LSD to achieve expansion of their consciousness. The book chronicles the acid tests, parties with LSD-laced Kool-Aid, and encounters with notable figures of the time: Hell's Angels, Grateful Dead, Allen Ginsberg, and describes Casey's exile to Mexico and his arrests. But this is how it spread, isn't it? Through these guys to the likes of the Grateful Dead, the Beatles, and then it just went all over Western society, didn't it?
Right. And, you know, I knew some of the guys. I was on the latter end of the 60s. So as a young teenager, all the Vietnam protests were happening. I knew Jane Fonda and Tom Hayden. They were married for a while. Tom Hayden led Students for a Democratic Society. And we were talking one night, you know, and he was saying they were all convinced that LSD was deliberately put into the anti-war movement to zap everybody out, to make everyone completely self-absorbed, forgetting about society and change and everything. And I think there's a lot of credence there, because one of the aspects of drug use is that it can have a really bad effect. Like my neighbor, when I was growing up, had a bad acid trip and he jumped off Lionsgate Bridge. It can trigger triggers latent paranoia, like all the things they're probing. You see, this is designed to probe the limits of human consciousness and how to control it, under the guise of, you know, being a hippy dippy cool guy, you know, trying to, what was Leary's slogan? Turn on, tune in, drop out. Right? Like, drop out of doing anything, man. Just lie there zonked out all day, right? And of course, yeah, the Beatles popularized it and all that. So that's the point. You make it so normalized that you don't see what it is, right? That's part of the strategy. Right?
Yeah, another book is Timothy's Leary's Jail Notes. What was another one of my favorite books, and that's at the Beatles. And here's there's a picture of the Grateful Dead as well, and like you said, that they were popularizing it. And what do you think then they learned from this experiment in phase 2, Kevin? What did the intelligence that was behind it? They ran this experiment. What did they glean from it?
That the chemical means of controlling the human brain is a loose cannon. You don't know how. People's biochemistry is different. Like native people, they never drank alcohol. So when a native person starts drinking, bang, it has a really bad effect. And I know because I've done funerals of people who've died from this alcohol poisoning. Some of our own people, the cause of death, alcohol poisoning, which hits natives harder, right? Asian people lack lactase to digest dairy products. Okay, so human biochemistry is really variable. So the same drug won't have the same effect on everyone. So that's why they moved on to stage 3, the electronic means. And it gets kind of weird at that point too, because I spoke to former researchers who said that in probing, you know, using electronic means to see how to control the human mind, this guy believed that certain portals were opened up energetically, in which other things came through that they hadn't counted on. And you know, native people are very clear about this. They said, like some of the Anasazi or Apache people in southwestern US say they have this legend that a door, many centuries before the whites came, a door in the heavens opened up, and these dragons came through among humanity, right? And they said by parallel, these experiments began to open up those portals into other dimensions. And an effect happened that they didn't count on, right? And maybe these serial killers that are running around doing this stuff, I mean, this is one example of it. But the point is, it's like a little kid experimenting with a gun they don't know how to operate. We don't know what the effect is on this. And I had a really very personal experience about that. after I got fired, I got a call from a woman named Larissa, and she was a psychic channeler in Vancouver. I was always skeptical about, these things. Had to see for myself and experience it. I met her at her home in Vancouver. She began to talk to me about my life, things no one could ever know about, things I'd never said. She was very tuned in. And she said she and two other people in her network had been reading me because they wanted to understand what this stuff was that I was opening up and why I was still alive, right, for one thing. And they said, she was sitting there holding my hands and saying, there's this device I keep saying. I kept wondering, like, why are they so upset about what you're doing, right? About all the resources and the land. She said, well, I see a lot of oil and gas, and I see it has to do with resources and that. Okay, but there's something else. And she talked about a big dome in the Sierra Nevada mountains in Northern California. This is fairly near Bohemian Grove, okay, this same area of the state. And she said, it's a form of psychic weaponry that they stole from the Soviets, who were kind of leading this research in psychic weaponry. And she said they've opened portals that they don't know how to control. And they have to understand what you're uncovering because it has to do with that. And you're not even, like, I was stumbling across these things. I didn't even know aware of what I was uncovering, but they were aware of it and they wanted to know more. So monitoring me, keeping me alive to see what I'm uncovering. Right. But also these native chiefs who were so attacking us. It wasn't just about because they were selling off the oil and gas to China and all that, which they do. And they didn't want me kind of mucking up the works by talking about their role in the residential school crimes and everything. It was more than that. It was about these controlled experiments that the Chinese are also very into. Through their own methods, their own history of how you control masses of people. So all of that said to me after, and the weird kind of finale to that is that Larissa gave me a panic phone call one night and said, one of the other two women in our circle has died all of a sudden. And I came to her door the next day to see what was going on. And she opens the door and looks at me like I'm a stranger. And she says, who are you? What do you want? And I said, Larissa, it's me. We've been seeing each other for 6 months. She said, no, get away. I know what you're up to. Get away from me. Boom, shut the door. Like, boom. And that's happened so many times with me. People who one moment are working, the next minute as a group, not just as individuals, but as a group. It's like watching, I call it the light switch treatment. Boom, off. And with a different narrative in their mind about who I am, like something has been inserted in there that wasn't there before, even a different personality. Now, it doesn't work with everybody. I mean, like we're having this conversation right now, right? So whether it doesn't work because there's a natural resistance, like, natural immunity to these things, or whether we're kept, allowed to do these things so that they can learn more, who knows? But that kind of manipulation on that level is also happening. So I didn't want to make it seem like it was just zapping people electronically. It's goes deeper than that. It's more systemic, more existential, I guess you could say. Right.
So I'm looking at some of the most famous cases of the earlier stages of MKUltra.
Yeah.
And with Rosemary Kennedy, eldest daughter to Joseph Kennedy, as a child, she exhibited development delays. In a young adult year, she was becoming increasingly irritable and difficult. In response to these issues, her father arranged a lobotomy on her in 1941 when she was 23 years of age. The procedure left her permanently incapacitated and rendered her unable to speak intelligibly. She spent most of the rest of her life being cared for at St. Coletta, an institution in Jefferson, Wisconsin. The truth about her situation and whereabouts was kept secret for decades, while she was initially isolated from her siblings and extended family following her lobotomy. She did go on to visit them during her later life. And they're also saying that Jackie had electroshock as well. And on this list here, we have got famous people who had electroshock. We've got Ernest Hemingway. He underwent ECT at the Mayo Clinic in 1961, shortly before his death. Kitty Dukakis, wife of Michael Dukakis, is a vocal advocate still for ECT. sharing her experiences with the treatment and overcoming depression. Lou Reed, the musician, received ECT as a teenager, which he later claimed induced multiple personality disorder and a lasting hatred of psychiatrists.
That was the point.
And then Judy Garland,
oh, yeah.
She had ECT as well. Any thoughts on these?
Oh, yeah. Well, it isn't just the celebrities. I mean, don't forget the former Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, who single-handedly signed over Canada to China. His mother, Margaret, Pierre Trudeau's wife, she was an early inmate at what's called the Hollywood Hospital in Vancouver, where they did early MKULTRA experiments. Margaret Sinclair Trudeau, had ECT at a young age, lots of a whole chemical regime she was on. And she was wingy. I mean, she used to do really nutty things in public and that. But all three of the Trudeau children were also taken to the Hollywood Hospital. We know that from nurses who worked there. I published this a number of years ago. And a former nurse who lives up in Kamloops now said she saw all three of the children brought in the early 1970s. They were all put in segregated rooms and worked on. These are like Manchurian candidate future prime ministers. Sasha, I think, one of the children died in a skiing accident. It's what you do in the cult. You sacrifice, usually the eldest child, but any child. It's a sign of cultic activity, right? And both Justin and his dad, Pierre Trudeau, prime ministers, both of them were Jesuit educated. You know, I mean, it's like the connections are pretty apparent. And they destroyed all the evidence of the Hollywood Hospital after it got closed in 1974. But I mean, it was part of that MKULTRA network.
So we've got the brain, we've got lobotomies, we've got chemicals, we've got electroshock. What was the fourth?
Well, I think, you know, what's going on now in terms of the incorporation of the human race into really what I think is a new organism. It's a cybernetic organism where the human energy field and mind are directly incorporated into an electronic network. And people don't have their own, not only their own minds anymore, but their own lives. And now I ride on the buses a lot, and I just watch, especially the younger generation, right? They got their iPad devices, but you'll notice they never put them away when they're not using them. They hold on to them like this and hold them close, usually to their chest. And they're being incorporated into that energy field. And you look at them when they're not looking, 98% of the time they're looking at it. And when they're not, their eyes are dull and lifeless. There's no emotion. There's no consciousness there. And I mean, it's not accidental. This is a bigger it's the ultimate genocide. It's omnicide. It's the destruction of the human race. And, you know, that's the challenge now. What do you do about it? When people are operating in that electronic field, how do you get out of it? And, you know, literally just turn it off. But that's a big problem. For the older you get, the easier it is. I mean, people of my generation, that we're not particularly wedded to that. We weren't raised on it, but the young generation has been. And through the various techniques, you know, we've talked about in previous shows and that, but you know, that's the real enemy now, this latter stage. It's their final solution, you know, to human independence. And that's danger that's threatening all of us.
So what's more dangerous then, Kevin? Is it what they're watching on these devices, or the fact that they've got, you know, they're sleeping with these devices and the microwave radiation is being absorbed and it's affecting the natural biochemistry and energy fields? Or is it a combination of all of these things?
Yes, and it's also the whole soup we're immersed in. And you know what I say to people? Best thing to do, anyone can do this. Get the hell out of the city, turn off all the devices. And remember what I said about the 7.83 hertz, the natural rhythm of the earth is the same as in our brain. You just go lie on the earth in a real nature area, not some park in the city, but out in the country. And you lie on the earth for half an hour. It takes usually 20 minutes to 40 minutes to deprogram. And you lie on the earth, and after a while, you're doing fine. You feel fine. You're happy. You know, it's like watching children run around and laughing and rolling around the hill together. It's like, wow, we're human again, right? And nobody is so plugged in that they can't return to it. We're not that far down the road yet in this, right? So that's part of our natural resistance we can do to that. And, you know, that's first step, I think, for anybody.
So Anna's wondering, are they also monitoring everybody through these devices?
Always, everything, everywhere. I mean, it's an interesting story about that. You might have heard of this English philosopher, Jeremy Bentham. And
Panopticon.
The Panopticon, yeah. His body, you probably know this, but his body's stuffed and in a case in the University College in London. He's just sitting there in a case, right? And a little guy with a hat on, right? It's funny. But he came up with this model for a prison called the Panopticon. And it's a circular tower, and all the cells face inward. And the prisoners regulate themselves because they know they're all being watched. And that was the model for society. He said, this can apply to city planning, to everything. So all the TV cameras, that's it. Panopticon means the all-seeing eye. And if we all think we're being watched, we'll regulate ourselves. And we're afraid all the time of we might get punished by this unknown little man behind the big mask, right? And I remember when the cameras first came out in Vancouver in the 70s, people were trashing them. They'd be smashing them, they'd be painting over them, saying, you don't have the right to film me. What are you doing? And now everybody does it, right? Being assimilated into that. But the monitoring is totally institutionalized now. So the only way to get out of it is to get out of it. And, you know, I just think it's still within our capacity to do that, right? We need to.
So it seems like the government has a fallback whenever they get caught doing something. For example, in this country, with these assaults on the ladies here, the government's complicit in. They're saying, well, we've learned from our mistakes. This happened in the past. We've made changes for the future. It just seems to be the same crap over and over again. And from the very beginning, when I read the definition of MKUltra, you said it's just evolved. It's not been closed down. It's stronger than ever. So could you expand on that a bit, please?
Well, it's the basic question that every ruler has always ever had. How do you keep people in line? And historically, it was done through violence and fear. You'd hang somebody up in the gibbet. You'd have public hangings in Charing Cross, right? I mean, but fear alone doesn't work. In fact, fear breeds resistance. Repression breeds resistance. And there's a lot of examples of that. So what they can't figure out is how to make it absolute, right? Because, and the example of the Panopticon, Jeremy Bentham found that the Panopticon prison didn't work in certain circumstances. And where it didn't work is when the prisoners stopped looking at the central tower and just started talking to each other. Okay? Because then Big Brother disappears and you just see each other, and that becomes more real than the all-seeing eye. And that's what they're afraid of. They're afraid of human autonomy. And that's when we do all our work with the common law courts and the assemblies and that. First thing we say, turn off your device and just get to know each other. Have the human contact that people are so starved for. Everyone's hungry for each other because we're social beings. We're meant to be with each other, right? And to love each other and raise our children, just be human. And that's what they can't allow. And so the best way to stop that agenda is just do what comes naturally, be human. And they know they can't deal with that, so they have to keep the fear up all the time. And that's the first biggest hurdle to get over in doing all this work, is getting people over their own self-concern and fear.